Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about getting high. This is a story about how a plant older than human civilization became the excuse for a war that reshaped entire societies, destroyed millions of lives, and changed the very fabric of law and order across the globe. So, if you're here for the journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to go deep. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. The world is wide, and this story touches every corner of it. Phone away. Distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, long before there were laws to break or borders to cross, there was a plant. It emerged on the high frozen plateau of Tibet some 28 million years ago, when the ancestors of humans were still small creatures clinging to branches in ancient forests. Cannabis sativa evolved in the thin air and harsh sunlight of Central Asia, developing the resinous compounds that would one day make it both sacred and criminal. For millions of years it grew wild across the steppes, spreading its seeds on the wind, adapting to new climates, waiting. Then humans arrived, and from the moment our species encountered this plant, we never let it go. The archaeological record tells a story of intimacy stretching back to the earliest days of agriculture. In the caves of what is now Taiwan, pottery shards bearing the unmistakable impressions of hemp cord have been dated to 10,000 years before the Common Era. The ancient Chinese counted hemp among their 5 sacred grains, though it was not a grain at all, recognizing its importance to survival alongside rice, wheat, millet, and soybeans. They used every part of the plant with an efficiency that borders on reverence. The seeds were pressed for oil and eaten for nutrition. The stalks were stripped and twisted into rope strong enough to bind ships and prisoners alike. The fibers were woven into cloth that could survive decades of wear. And the flowers, those sticky, resinous clusters that would cause so much trouble in centuries to come, were ground into medicines and burned in sacred rituals. The oldest known paper fragments, dating to the 2nd century before the Common Era, were made from hemp fibre. While Europe was still scratching messages onto animal skins, China was recording its history, its poetry, its laws on sheets of processed cannabis. But it was not only the practical applications that bound humans to this plant. In the high mountains of western China, at a site called Jiuzhankal Cemetery, archaeologists recently discovered wooden braziers containing the charred remains of cannabis with remarkably high concentrations of the psychoactive compound we now call THC. These burners were placed in tombs 2,500 years ago, part of funeral rites designed to send the dead onward and perhaps to help the living touch something beyond ordinary consciousness. The ancient Greeks knew of these practices. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, described the funeral customs of the Scythians, those fierce nomadic horsemen who ruled the steppes from the Black Sea to the borders of China. After burying their dead, he wrote, the Scythians would construct small tents from wooden poles and felt blankets, place red-hot stones in the centre, and throw hemp seeds onto the flames. The vapour would rise and fill the enclosed space, and the mourners would inhale deeply, crying out with pleasure at the effects. This was not recreation in any modern sense. This was ritual, sacrament, a technology for crossing the boundary between the living and the dead. The plant that grew wild on the Tibetan plateau had become a vehicle for transcendence, and as trade routes expanded and caravans began their long journeys along what we now call the Silk Road, cannabis travelled with them, carried by merchants and monks and conquerors into every corner of the known world. The ropes that held civilization together were woven from hemp. This is not metaphor, but material fact. Every great navy of the age of sail depended on cannabis for its existence. A single warship of the line required between 50 and 100 tons of hemp in various forms, from the massive anchor cables thick as a man's thigh to the fine threads that stitched the sails. The word canvas itself derives from cannabis, a linguistic fossil preserving the memory of what those great billowing sheets were made from. The rigging that allowed sailors to climb the masts, the caulking that kept seawater from flooding the holds, the ropes that hauled cargo and prisoners and treasure across the oceans. All of it came from the same tall, fibrous plant that shamans had been burning in their rituals for millennia. The British Empire, which would one day circle the globe and claim dominion over a quarter of the world's population, floated on hemp. By the 18th century, Britain's Royal Navy was consuming such vast quantities that domestic production could not keep pace. Fully 90% of the rope and sail fibre used by British ships came from Russia, transported at enormous expense across the Baltic Sea. This dependency was not merely commercial, but strategic. When Napoleon sought to break British power, one of his primary tactics was the continental system, designed to cut off Britain's access to Russian hemp. The War of 1812, taught in American schools as a conflict over impressment and national honour, was fought in part over access to this single crop. Hemp was not agriculture, it was infrastructure, it was military capacity, it was the ability to project power across oceans and continents. When English colonists arrived on the shores of what would become the United States, they brought hemp seeds in their pockets and hemp cultivation in their plans. The Virginia Assembly passed its first hemp law in 1619, just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, requiring every farmer to grow the crop. This was not a suggestion, but a mandate backed by the force of law. King James I himself decreed that colonists must produce 100 hemp plants each for export to the mother country. The crown needed rope for its navy, and the colonies would provide it. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, hemp cultivation spread across colonial America, with the blessing and active encouragement of every level of government. In Virginia, during periods of shortage between 1763 and 1767, farmers could actually be jailed for refusing to grow hemp. The plant was so valuable, so essential to the functioning of colonial society, that it served as legal tender in multiple colonies. You could pay your taxes in hemp. You could settle your debts with it. You could buy land with bales of processed fibre. The founding fathers were not merely aware of hemp cultivation, but active participants in it. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon, recording in his diary on August 7th, 1765, that he had begun to separate the male from the female plants, a practice that suggests interest in more than just fibre production. Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello and invented a machine to make the processing of hemp fibre less brutal for the enslaved people forced to do the work. Benjamin Franklin owned a mill that produced hemp paper. The early drafts of the Declaration of Independence, that sacred document proclaiming the rights of man and the crimes of tyrants, were written on paper made from hemp fibre. The covered wagons that would later push westward across the prairies, carrying settlers into territories that would become states, were topped with canvas stretched across wooden frames. The word pioneer is inseparable from the material reality of hemp. When Levi Strauss began making durable work pants for gold miners in California, he used hemp fiber to create a fabric tough enough to survive the brutal conditions of the mines. This was not counterculture. This was the establishment. The founders of the American Republic were not rebels for growing hemp. They would have been criminals for refusing to grow it. For most of the 19th century and well into the 20th, cannabis was medicine, not alternative medicine, not folk remedy, not the desperate resort of those excluded from proper care, but mainstream, respectable, doctor-prescribed medicine available at any pharmacy in America. The transformation began in 1839 when an Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy published the results of his research in India, where he had been serving with the British East India Company. O'Shaughnessy had observed the traditional uses of cannabis among Indian practitioners and conducted his own experiments, documenting the plant's remarkable effectiveness for conditions ranging from muscle spasms to rheumatism to the convulsions of tetanus. He brought samples back to Britain and sparked a wave of medical interest that would cross the Atlantic within years. By 1850, cannabis was officially listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the authoritative compendium of recognized medicines. It would remain there for 91 years until 1942. During that time, More than 2,000 cannabis medicines were produced by more than 280 manufacturers. These were not shadowy operations selling snake oil from the backs of wagons. These were the pharmaceutical giants whose names still dominate medicine today. Park Davis produced cannabis tinctures, so did Eli Lilly, so did Squibb, so did Upjohn. The bottle in your great-grandmother's medicine cabinet, the one she used for menstrual cramps or headaches or trouble sleeping, might well have contained an extract of cannabis. In 1892, Sir William Osler, one of the founding fathers of modern medicine, and a name still revered in medical schools around the world, declared cannabis the most satisfactory remedy for migraines. You could buy these preparations without a prescription at the pharmacy or the general store as casually as you might buy aspirin today. There was no stigma attached, no moral panic, no concern about the corruption of youth or the collapse of civilization. Cannabis was simply medicine, one tool among many in the endless human effort to ease suffering. But there were two kinds of cannabis in the world, and they were about to collide. The hemp grown for rope and paper and cloth was a variety bred over centuries to maximize the tough fibers in its stalk while minimizing the sticky resin on its flowers. You could smoke a bale of industrial hemp and feel nothing but the burn in your lungs. But in the warmer climates of India, Mexico, the Caribbean, other varieties had been cultivated for precisely the opposite purpose: plants bred to produce abundant resinous flowers, rich in the compounds that alter consciousness. These drug varieties had their own ancient histories, their own cultural contexts, their own patterns of use. For millennia they had existed in separate worlds, the hemp of the sailors and the cannabis of the shamans, the fibre of empires and the flowers of transcendence. Then the world changed. The age of exploration gave way to the age of migration, and migration brought fear, and fear demanded a scapegoat. In 1910, Mexico exploded. The revolution that would consume the country for the next decade sent waves of violence rippling across the northern states, driving hundreds of thousands of people from their homes and toward the border. They came on foot and on horseback, by train when the trains were running, carrying what they could and leaving behind everything they had known. Between 1910 and 1930, the Mexican-born population in the United States tripled, rising from roughly 200,000 to more than 600,000, and those were only the ones who were counted. 70% of them were single men, young and strong and desperate for work, and they found it in the fields and mines and railroads of the American Southwest. They picked cotton in Texas and sugar beets in Colorado. They laid track across the desert and dug copper from the mountains of Arizona. They filled the labor gaps that American industry required, doing the brutal work that built the infrastructure of the growing nation, and they were hated for it. The same economic forces that drew them north generated the resentment that would be weaponized against them. White workers saw competition. White communities saw invasion. The pseudoscience of eugenics, which was then at the height of its respectability, provided intellectual cover for what was really just old-fashioned bigotry. Mexican immigrants were declared biologically inferior, racially deficient, incapable of assimilation. By 1925, the Ku Klux Klan had emerged as a dominant political force in Colorado, and its targets were not only black Americans but the brown-skinned workers in the beet fields. The immigrants brought with them their language, their food, their music, their faith, and their customs. Among those customs was the smoking of marijuana. It was a working-class habit, cheap and accessible, a way to relax after 12 hours of back-breaking labor in the fields. For the men who used it, marijuana was no different from the beer that German immigrants drank or the whiskey that sustained the Irish. It was simply what they did, but in the eyes of white America, it was something else entirely. It was proof of their foreignness, their danger, their unfitness for citizenship. It was an excuse. The The transformation happened through language. Before the great wave of Mexican immigration, Americans who knew the plant at all called it cannabis or hashish or Indian hemp. These were the terms in the medical literature, the pharmacy catalogues, the patent medicine advertisements. Cannabis was the stuff in the tincture bottles, the compound that doctors prescribed for headaches and cramps and sleeplessness. It was familiar, domestic, respectable. Then a new word entered the American vocabulary, a word that sounded foreign because it was meant to sound foreign: marijuana. The term came from Mexican Spanish, and it was adopted deliberately by those who wished to make the plant seem alien and threatening. When police in Los Angeles raided establishments selling marijuana in 1914, the newspapers had to explain to their readers what the drug actually was, because most Americans had never heard the word. They did not realize that the dangerous marijuana the police were confiscating was the same cannabis their own doctors were prescribing. This was the trick, the con that would run for more than a century. One plant, two names. Cannabis was legal, respectable, American. Marijuana was illegal, dangerous, Mexican. The same compound that your grandmother purchased at the pharmacy to help her sleep was transformed into a foreign menace when it crossed the border in the pockets of brown-skinned workers. Doctors continued to prescribe cannabis while police arrested people for marijuana, and most Americans never understood that they were talking about the same thing. The word was the weapon. By giving the plant a Mexican name, prohibitionists could tap into the deep reservoirs of anti-immigrant hatred that were already poisoning American politics. They did not have to argue that cannabis was dangerous because decades of medical use had proven it was not. They simply had to associate marijuana with Mexicans and let prejudice do the rest. The first city to ban marijuana was El Paso, Texas. On June 3, 1915, the city council passed an emergency ordinance prohibiting the sale and possession of the drug, citing its dangerous and powerful properties and the injury it caused to public health and public morals. The next morning, the El Paso Morning Times reported on the new law with breathless excitement, declaring marijuana the deadliest drug on the market and claiming that it creates a lust for human blood in the users. Sheriff Stanley Good told reporters that the drug drives men to killing madness. This was a plant that doctors had been prescribing for 70 years, a medicine listed in the official pharmacopoeia of the United States, suddenly transformed into a substance that turned peaceful men into bloodthirsty killers. The escalation was absurd, but the purpose was clear. 1915 El Paso was a border city with a large and growing Mexican population. The Anglo establishment wanted tools to control that population, to arrest and deport and intimidate at will. Criminalizing marijuana gave the police exactly what they needed. Now any Mexican worker could be stopped, searched and jailed simply for possessing something that was part of his culture. The first marijuana law in America was not about public health. It was about population control. It was about giving law enforcement the authority to target a specific community. And it worked. Within a decade, the pattern had repeated across the Southwest. State after state passed anti-marijuana laws, and in nearly every case, the legislative record makes clear who the real targets were. The legislators said it out loud. They did not hide behind euphemism or pretend their motivations were anything other than what they were. In Texas, a state senator explained his support for the 1919 marijuana ban by declaring that all Mexicans are crazy, and this stuff is what makes them crazy. Professor Charles Whitebread of USC Law School would later observe that you did not have to go anywhere but to the legislative records to understand what had motivated these laws. The racism was not buried between the lines. It was the text itself. In Montana, in 1929, the state legislature took up a bill to prohibit marijuana, describing it as Mexican opium. A physician named Dr. Fred Fulcher testified in favor of the ban, explaining that when some beet-field peon takes a few rares of this stuff, he thinks he has just been elected president of Mexico, so he starts out to execute all his political enemies. The newspaper covering the hearing reported that everybody laughed and the bill was recommended for passage. There it is, preserved in the official record. The cruelty was the entertainment. The suffering of Mexican workers was the joke. These laws were not reluctant compromises forced by genuine public health concerns. They were celebrations of bigotry, performances of power enacted with laughter and contempt. The marijuana prohibition that would eventually consume millions of lives and cost trillions of dollars began as a punchline at the expense of men who picked crops and laid railroad ties and wanted nothing more than to rest at the end of the day. But marijuana prohibition was not only about Mexicans. Even as the anti-immigrant panic was sweeping the Southwest, another great migration was reshaping America. Millions of Black Americans were leaving the rural South, fleeing the terrorism of lynching and the grinding poverty of sharecropping, heading north to the cities where factories promised wages and a measure of freedom. They brought with them their music, and that music would conquer the world. Jazz emerged from New Orleans and spread up the Mississippi to Chicago, east to Kansas City and beyond to Harlem. It was revolutionary not only in its sound but in its implications. Jazz was improvisation, spontaneity, the freedom to break from the written score and create something new in the moment. And the musicians who played it discovered that marijuana enhanced these qualities, slowing time and heightening perception, allowing them to hear spaces between the notes that sober ears might miss. Louis Armstrong was a lifelong user who called the drug gauge and credited it with helping him relax and play more freely. Cab Calloway recorded songs like Reefer Man that celebrated marijuana culture with playful defiance. Within the jazz community, marijuana was simply part of the scene, as unremarkable as the cigarettes that filled the ashtrays. But white America saw something different. White America saw danger. Jazz was condemned as primitive, as sexually provocative, as the music of the jungle threatening to corrupt white youth. The speakeasies and dance halls where races mixed and bodies moved together were treated as sites of contagion, and marijuana, already associated with Mexicans in the Southwest, now became associated with black musicians in the urban North. A 1917 Treasury Department report expressed concern about marijuana use among Mexicans and sometimes Negroes and lower-class whites, and warned that users might harm or assault upper-class white women while under its influence. The fear was always the same: brown and black men losing their inhibitions, threatening the purity of white women, overturning the racial order. The drug was just the excuse. By the late 1920s, marijuana had been criminalized in dozens of states, but these were scattered local battles, fragmented and inconsistent. What came next would be different. What came next was a single man with a federal badge, a genius for propaganda, and a hatred he barely bothered to disguise. His name was Harry Anslinger, and he would dedicate his career to the eradication of marijuana, not because it was dangerous, but because the people who used it were the people he despised. Harry Jacob Anslinger was born on May 20th, 1892 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, the son of a Swiss immigrant barber. He was not a doctor, not a scientist, not a pharmacologist. He was a bureaucrat, a railroad detective who had worked his way into federal law enforcement during the alcohol prohibition years. In 1930, at the age of 38, he was appointed the first commissioner of the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a position he would hold for an astonishing 32 years, spanning 5 presidencies from Hoover to Kennedy. The appointment was pure nepotism. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, one of the richest men in America, was Anslinger's wife's uncle. Mellon wanted a loyal man in the position, and family was the surest guarantee of loyalty. But if nepotism put Anslinger in power, ideology and institutional survival kept him there. When alcohol prohibition ended in 1933, the vast enforcement apparatus that had been built to chase bootleggers suddenly faced an existential crisis. Budgets were being slashed, agents were being laid off. The Bureau of Narcotics needed a new enemy to justify its existence, a new crusade to secure its funding. Anslinger looked at the scattered state-level marijuana laws that had been passed over the previous 2 decades, saw an opportunity and seized it. Marijuana was largely unregulated at the federal level. It was associated with populations that respectable America already feared and despised. It was the perfect target for a bureaucrat who needed a war to fight. What followed was one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in American history, a masterclass in manufacturing panic through selective storytelling and outright lies. Anslinger understood that fear shapes public opinion more effectively than facts, and racial fear most effectively of all. He cultivated relationships with newspaper editors across the country, feeding them a steady stream of lurid stories designed to terrify readers into supporting federal prohibition. He collected what he called his Gore Files, a compilation of approximately 200 cases in which violent crimes had allegedly been committed under the influence of marijuana. When researchers later examined these files, they found that 198 of the 200 cases had no documented connection to cannabis whatsoever. The remaining 2 could not be disproved only because no records existed one way or the other. The files were fiction dressed as evidence. Anslinger himself seemed to know this. When he asked 30 doctors to confirm that cannabis caused the violence he described, 29 of them told him there was no such connection. He ignored them and continued to tell the stories anyway. His favorite case was Victor Licata, a 21-year-old Tampa man who murdered his entire family with an axe in October 1933. Anslinger used Licata's story for decades, describing him as a sane, rather quiet young man who had been driven to unspeakable violence by marijuana. It was a compelling narrative, terrifying in its implications. It was also a lie. The psychiatric records told a different story entirely. A year before the murders, Licata's parents had attempted to have him committed to a mental institution. Doctors had diagnosed him with dementia precox, a condition we now call schizophrenia, and noted his homicidal tendencies. His family had a documented history of mental illness. His paternal granduncle and 2 cousins had been institutionalized. His parents were first cousins, a detail that would have been significant to the eugenicists of the era. Most damningly, marijuana was never mentioned in any of his psychiatric evaluations, not before the murders, not after. Victor Licata did not kill his family because of marijuana. He killed them because he was severely mentally ill and had not received treatment. He would die by suicide in the Florida State Hospital in 1950, having spent his final years in the very institution his parents had tried to place him in before the tragedy. None of this mattered to Anslinger. The story served its purpose. The truth was irrelevant. The racism that animated Anslinger's crusade was not subtle, not coded, not hidden between the lines. It was explicit, documented, and preserved in the official record. In his congressional testimony supporting the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, Anslinger declared that marijuana is taken by musicians, and I am not speaking about good musicians, but the jazz type. The jazz type. The meaning was clear to everyone in the room. In his personal files, which are now housed at Penn State University, Anslinger kept detailed notes on cases that obsessed him. One memo described colored students at the University of Minnesota partying with white female students, smoking marijuana, and getting their sympathy with stories of racial persecution. The result, he noted with evident alarm, was pregnancy. This was the fear that pulsed beneath the propaganda. Not that marijuana was physically dangerous, because the medical evidence did not support that claim. Not that it led to harder drugs, because that theory had not yet been invented. The fear was that marijuana broke down racial barriers. The fear was that it brought white women into contact with black and brown men. The fear was miscegenation, racial mixing, the collapse of the boundaries that segregation was designed to enforce. Cannabis was blamed for making white women sympathetic to stories of racial persecution, as if sympathy for the persecuted were a pathology to be prevented. During the congressional hearings, a letter from a Floyd Basket of Alamosa, Colorado, was read into the official record. It described the problems caused by marijuana among, in Basquet's words, our degenerate Spanish-speaking residents. He explained that this was why the marijuana problem was so great, because the greatest percentage of our population is composed of Spanish-speaking persons, most of whom are low mentally because of social and racial conditions. This letter was not dismissed as the racist screed it was. It was entered into the record as evidence supporting federal prohibition. Some of the most inflammatory quotes attributed to Anslinger cannot be verified to primary sources. Penn State Libraries, which holds his papers, has stated that certain widely circulated quotations cannot be confirmed. But what is confirmed, what is documented beyond dispute, is damning enough. The campaign against marijuana was never primarily about pharmacology or public health. It was about policing the boundaries between races, about controlling populations that the establishment viewed as threatening, about giving law enforcement tools to arrest and imprison people whose real crime was existing while brown or black in America. Anslinger kept a file called Marijuana and Musicians, and the names in that file read like a roster of American genius. Louis Armstrong, Thelonious Monk, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, Billie Holiday. These were the artists who were inventing a new American art form, creating music that would outlast their persecutors by generations. Anslinger dreamed of orchestrating a large-scale national roundup of these musicians he dismissed as tea-hounds. Louis Armstrong was the first celebrity arrested for marijuana, taken into custody outside the Cotton Club in November 1930 and held for 9 days before the charges were quietly dropped. But it was Billie Holiday who became the target of Anslinger's most sustained persecution. Holiday had achieved something that frightened the authorities in ways they could barely articulate. In 1939, she began performing Strange Fruit, a song about lynching that described black bodies swinging in the southern breeze with an unflinching directness that left audiences shaken. The song was protest as art, a refusal to look away from American atrocity. Federal agents began following Holiday almost immediately. They tracked her movements, cultivated informants in her circle, waited for their opportunity. In 1947, they arrested her on drug charges. She was convicted and sentenced to a year and a day in federal prison at the Alderson facility in West Virginia. When she was released, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics arranged for her cabaret license to be revoked, effectively banning her from performing in any club that served alcohol, which meant virtually every venue in New York. Her crime was not drug use. Judy Garland, the white star of The Wizard of Oz, struggled with heroin addiction during the same period, and Anslinger personally arranged for MGM to send her to rehabilitation rather than prison. He said he believed her to be a fine woman caught in a situation that could only destroy her. Compassion for the white addict, persecution for the black one. Holiday spent the final years of her life fighting to regain her cabaret card, her career diminished, her health failing. In July 1959, she was admitted to Metropolitan Hospital in New York, dying of cirrhosis of the liver. She was 44 years old. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics arrived at her hospital room, claiming to have found heroin in her possession. They handcuffed her to the bed. They fingerprinted her. They placed her under arrest. She died on July 17th, 1959, technically in police custody, a prisoner to the end. The drug war knew the difference between white addiction and black addiction from the very beginning. It still does. The machinery for federal prohibition came together with astonishing speed and almost no scrutiny. House Resolution 6385, the Marijuana Tax Act, was introduced on April 14, 1937. The hearings lasted a total of 5 days spread across late April and early May. The bill passed the House with less than 2 pages of debate in the congressional record. There was no roll call vote. Most members of Congress had no idea what they were voting on. On August 2, 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the bill into law. It went into effect on October 1st. In less than 6 months, a plant that had been cultivated by humans for 10,000 years, that had been listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia for nearly a century, that was the source of thousands of medicines produced by the nation's most respected pharmaceutical companies, became effectively illegal. The law did not technically ban marijuana. Instead, it imposed a prohibitively expensive tax on anyone who cultivated, prescribed, sold, or possessed the drug, along with registration requirements and paperwork so burdensome that compliance was effectively impossible. It was prohibition through bureaucracy, criminalization through red tape. There was opposition, though it was steamrolled. Dr. William C. Woodward, the legislative counsel for the American Medical Association, traveled to Washington to testify against the bill. He told the committee that the American Medical Association knows of no evidence that marijuana is a dangerous drug. He criticized the use of the term marijuana rather than cannabis, arguing that the unfamiliar word had prevented the medical community from understanding what was actually being proposed. He asked pointed questions about why the bill had been drafted in secret without consulting the profession that would be most affected. A committee member responded with contempt. "If you cannot say something good about what we are trying to do, why don't you go home?" When the bill reached the floor of the House, a member asked whether the American Medical Association supported it. A colleague replied that their doctor, whom he misidentified as Dr. Wharton, had given the bill his full support. It was a lie told on the floor of Congress, and no one corrected it. And so, almost overnight, a plant that had been cultivated for 10,000 years became contraband. The war had been declared. The enemy had been named. But Harry Anslinger was just the beginning. The machinery he built would be inherited by presidents who understood its true purpose even better than he did. And they would use it not just to arrest musicians and migrants. They would use it to break entire movements, to shatter entire communities, to fill prisons until they burst. The war on marijuana was about to become the war on drugs. And the casualties would number in the millions. 5 years after Harry Anslinger succeeded in making marijuana a federal crime, the United States government came begging for hemp. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and subsequently seized the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, America suddenly lost access to the Manila hemp that supplied its military with rope and rigging. The Navy needed cordage for its ships. The Army needed webbing for its parachutes. The war effort required hemp, and domestic cultivation had been effectively destroyed by the very prohibition the government had enacted. The response was a reversal so complete it would be comical if it were not so revealing. In 1942, the United States Department of Agriculture produced a propaganda film called Hemp for Victory, urging American farmers to plant the crop as their patriotic duty. The government distributed over 400,000 pounds of hemp seeds. More than 42 hemp processing mills were built with federal funds across the Midwest. Farmers who agreed to grow hemp were exempted from military service, their work on the home front deemed essential to victory. By the end of the war, more than 400,000 acres of hemp were under cultivation. The plant that had been declared a menace to public health and morals in 1937 was saving American lives by 1943. The cognitive dissonance was never acknowledged, never explained, and the moment the war ended, so did the tolerance. The hemp fields were ploughed under, the processing mills were closed, the permits were revoked. The final commercial hemp harvest in the United States occurred in Wisconsin in 1957, and then the plant that had built the nation disappeared from its fields. The government tried to erase the evidence of its own hypocrisy. For decades, officials denied that that hemp for victory had ever been made. The Library of Congress told inquirers that no such film existed. The USDA claimed to have no record of it. It was not until 1989, when activists donated VHS copies to the Library of Congress, that the film was officially acknowledged. It now sits in the National Archives, a monument to the absurdity at the heart of prohibition. The war on marijuana might have remained a relatively minor affair, a tool for harassing Mexican workers and black musicians, if not for what happened in the 1960s. The counterculture that exploded across America in that decade was many things at once. It was a youth rebellion, a sexual revolution, a rejection of the conformity that had defined the post-war years. It was opposition to the Vietnam War, to segregation, to the suffocating expectations of parents and institutions. And it was, undeniably, a drug culture. The Beat generation had laid the groundwork in the 1950s. Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs wrote about marijuana and other substances as tools for expanding consciousness, as escapes from the deadening routines of mainstream America. But the Beats were marginal. A small subculture of artists and intellectuals clustered in San Francisco and Greenwich Village. What happened in the 1960s was something far larger. The Summer of Love in 1967 drew 100,000 young people to the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. Woodstock in 1969 gathered more than 400,000 at a farm in upstate New York. The marijuana smoke that hung over these gatherings was not incidental, it was sacrament. To smoke marijuana was to declare yourself in opposition to the war, to racism, to the entire apparatus of authority that your parents' generation had built. It was a political act wrapped in rolling papers, and the establishment was terrified. These were not Mexican laborers or black jazz musicians. These were white middle-class kids, the sons and daughters of respectable families, dropping out, tuning in, turning their backs on everything they had been raised to value. Parents saw their children becoming strangers. Politicians saw an opportunity. Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968 on a platform of law and order, a phrase that meant different things to different audiences, but always carried the same subtext. The streets would be made safe. The troublemakers would be dealt with. The chaos of the 1960s would be brought under control. His campaign promised a vigorous nationwide drive against the traffickers in narcotics and dangerous drugs, with special emphasis on the first steps toward addiction, which meant marijuana. Nixon won, and the war on drugs that Anslinger had started became something far more systematic and far more brutal. The true purpose of that war would not be confirmed until decades later. But when the confirmation came, it was devastating. In 1994, a journalist named Dan Baum interviewed John Ehrlichman, who had served as Nixon's domestic policy advisor before going to prison for his role in the Watergate scandal. What Ehrlichman told Baum was not published until 2016 after Ehrlichman's death, but it has become the most quoted passage in the history of drug policy. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I am saying? We knew we could not make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Ehrlichman's family later disputed the quote, but the Nixon administration's racism is corroborated by other sources. The Oval Office tapes, secretly recorded by Nixon himself, capture his private thoughts with brutal clarity. In May 1971, he told his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, that he wanted a goddamn strong statement on marijuana, one that just tears the arse out of them. In another conversation, Haldeman's diary records Nixon, saying that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks, and that the key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. This was not conspiracy theory. This was strategy, articulated in the president's own words, preserved for history in his own recordings. The Controlled Substances Act was signed into law on October 27, 1970, and it created the framework for drug enforcement that persists to this day. Drugs were sorted into 5 schedules based on their potential for abuse and their accepted medical value. Marijuana was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, defined as having a high potential for abuse and no currently accepted medical use. It was classified alongside heroin and LSD, and above cocaine and methamphetamine, which were placed in Schedule 2. The classification was supposed to be temporary. The law specified that marijuana's placement was pending the completion of a study by a commission Nixon himself had appointed. The Schaefer Commission, named after its chairman, former Republican Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer, spent 2 years examining the evidence. In March 1972, they delivered their report, titled Marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding. Their conclusions were unambiguous. The criminal law is too harsh a tool to apply to personal possession, even in the effort to discourage use, they wrote. Neither the marijuana user nor the drug itself can be said to constitute a danger to public safety. They recommended that possession for personal use should no longer be a criminal offense. Nixon had already made clear he would ignore them. In a taped Oval Office conversation from September 1971, months before the commission had even finished its work, Nixon told Schaefer that he was enough of a pro to know that for you to come out with something that would run counter to what the Congress feels and what the country feels and what we are planning to do would make your commission just look bad as hell. He instructed Schaefer to keep your commission in line. When the report was released recommending decriminalization, Nixon rejected it entirely. He declared publicly that even if the commission recommended legalization, he would not follow that recommendation. The science did not matter. The evidence did not matter. The Schedule I classification that was supposed to be temporary became permanent, and it remains in effect more than 50 years later. Marijuana is still classified as having no accepted medical use, despite being legal for medical purposes in more than 40 states. The numbers tell the story of what happened next, and the numbers are almost too large to comprehend. In 1970, the total prison population of the United States was approximately 200,000 people. By 1980, it had grown to 329,000. By 2014, it had reached 1,508,636, a 600% increase in a period when the general population grew by only 51%. The war on drugs did not cause all of this explosion, but it was the primary engine. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed in the hysteria following the cocaine overdose deaths of basketball star Len Bias and football player Don Rogers, created mandatory minimum sentences that stripped judges of discretion and guaranteed long prison terms for drug offences. The law created the infamous 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine, meaning that possession of 5 grams of crack carried the same mandatory 5-year sentence as possession of 500 grams of powder. Crack was the drug of poor black neighborhoods. Powder was the drug of wealthy white ones. The racial impact was immediate and devastating. Before the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, approximately 50 out of every 100,000 black adults were sent to federal prison. Within a few years, that number had risen to 250 out of every 100,000. The black incarceration rate, already grotesquely high, nearly tripled in a single generation, rising from 600 per 100,000 in 1970 to over 1,800 per 100,000 by 2000. And marijuana was the entry point, the most common charge, the easiest arrest to make. Since 1970, more than 26 million Americans have been arrested for marijuana offences. 26 million. That is more than the entire population of Australia. 88% of those arrests were for simple possession, not dealing, not trafficking, just having a small amount for personal use. Between 2001 and 2010, police made a marijuana arrest every 37 seconds, one arrest every 37 seconds for a decade. the collateral consequences of those arrests extended far beyond the jail time served. A marijuana conviction could mean the loss of federal student aid, the denial of public housing, the revocation of professional licenses, the destruction of employment prospects, the termination of parental rights, the loss of the right to vote. A single joint could derail an entire life, and the weight of this enforcement fell, as it had always fallen, on black and brown communities. Despite roughly equal rates of marijuana use across racial groups, Black Americans were and are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for possession. In some states, the disparity is far worse. In Montana and Kentucky, black people are more than 9 times more likely to be arrested. In some counties, the ratio reaches 20, 30, even 50 to 1. The pattern that began in El Paso in 1915, the use of marijuana laws to target and control minority populations, continued unbroken into the 21st century. 26 million arrests, 600% increase in incarceration, 1 arrest every 37 seconds. And for what? Did prohibition stop marijuana use? It did not. Did it make communities safer? It did not. Did it protect public health? It did not. What it did was what it was designed to do. It disrupted. It controlled. It filled prisons until they became an industry unto themselves. And then slowly something began to shift. Not because the powerful changed their minds, but because the people did. The change began not in the halls of Congress or the chambers of state legislatures, but in the hospital wards where young men were dying. In the 1980s, a plague swept through the gay communities of America's cities, killing with terrifying speed and leaving behind wasted bodies that looked like survivors of concentration camps. AIDS destroyed the immune system, and the early treatments were almost as brutal as the disease. Patients suffered from nausea so severe they could not eat, from wasting that stripped the flesh from their bones, from pain that conventional medicine struggled to address. And in San Francisco, in the Castro district where the epidemic hit hardest, patients began to discover something their doctors could not officially acknowledge. Cannabis helped. It stimulated appetite in people who had lost all desire to eat. It reduced the nausea caused by the toxic medications that offered the only hope of survival. It eased the chronic pain that made every day a struggle. For men who were counting their remaining weeks, cannabis was not recreation, it was medicine, and often it was the only thing that worked. Dennis Perron was a Vietnam veteran and openly gay activist who had been selling marijuana in San Francisco since the 1970s. When his partner Jonathan West was diagnosed with AIDS, Perron watched cannabis ease his suffering in ways that legal pharmaceuticals could not. West testified at one of Perron's drug trials, describing how marijuana helped him cope with his illness. He died in 1990, and his death transformed Perron from a dealer into a crusader. In 1991 or 1992, Perron opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club, the first public marijuana dispensary in the United States. It operated openly, serving patients who arrived with notes from their doctors, providing a space that was part pharmacy and part community center for people who had been abandoned by their government. At its peak, more than 8,000 patients were members. Mary Jane Rathbun, a grandmother in her 60s who became known as Brownie Mary, baked over 1,600 cannabis brownies every month and gave them away free to AIDS patients. She was arrested twice and became a folk hero, her white hair and grandmotherly demeanor a rebuke to everything the drug warriors had claimed about marijuana users. Perron took the next step. He drafted Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, and gathered the signatures needed to place it on the California ballot. On November 5, 1996, California voters approved the measure with 56% support, making their state the first in the nation to legalize marijuana for medical use. The dam had cracked. The flood would follow. The path from medical marijuana in California to recreational dispensaries across America took another 16 years. But when the breakthrough came, it came decisively. On November 6, 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington state approved ballot measures to legalize marijuana for adult recreational use, becoming the first jurisdictions in the world to do so through democratic vote. The campaigns that won those elections had learned from decades of failure. They did not argue that marijuana was harmless or that people had a right to get high. They made the pragmatic case. Prohibition has failed. It has cost billions of dollars and destroyed millions of lives without reducing use or protecting public health. Legalization means regulation, taxation, and control. It means taking the market away from criminals and putting it in the hands of licensed businesses. It means treating marijuana like alcohol, legal for adults, regulated for safety, taxed for public benefit. The message worked. The first legal recreational sales in Colorado began on January 1st, 2014, and the world did not end. Tax revenue poured into state coffers. Crime did not spike. Traffic fatalities did not soar. The apocalyptic predictions of the prohibitionists failed to materialize. In August 2013, the Obama administration issued what became known as the Cole Memorandum, directing federal prosecutors not to interfere with state marijuana laws as long as states maintained strict regulatory controls. The floodgates opened. Oregon and Alaska legalized in 2014. California, Nevada, Massachusetts, and Maine followed in 2016. By 2025, more than 24 states and the District of Columbia had legalized recreational marijuana. Total tax revenue from legal cannabis sales since 2014 has exceeded $24 billion. The legal marijuana industry has become a multi-billion-dollar sector of the American economy, complete with publicly traded companies, venture capital investment, and celebrity endorsements. The plant that was demonized for a century is now a commodity. But legalization has not meant justice, and the statistics that prove this are as damning as any from the Prohibition era. In 2020, the American Civil Liberties Union released a report analyzing marijuana arrest data across the country. Their findings were stark. Despite roughly equal rates of marijuana use across racial groups, Black Americans remain 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white Americans. Not in the past. Now. In every single state in the country, Black people are more likely to be arrested than white people for the same behavior. In 31 states, the racial disparity actually worsened between 2010 and 2018, the very period when legalization was spreading. In Montana and Kentucky, Black people are more than 9 times more likely to be arrested. In some individual counties, the disparity reaches 20, 30, even 50 times higher. These numbers represent the continuation of a pattern that began in El Paso in 1915 and has never been broken. The war on marijuana was designed to target specific populations, and it still does. Legalization in some states has not changed the fundamental reality that in most of America, police still use marijuana as a tool for controlling Black and brown communities. Equal use, unequal arrest, equal behavior, unequal punishment, a century of prohibition, and the racial targeting continues as if Harry Anslinger were still issuing the orders. The cruelest irony of the legal marijuana industry is who profits from it and who remains locked out. According to industry surveys, approximately 81% of cannabis business owners in America are white. Between 1 and 2% are Black. The people who are getting rich from legal marijuana are overwhelmingly from the same communities that were protected from the worst of prohibition. The people who went to prison, who had their families destroyed, who carry criminal records that will follow them for life, are overwhelmingly from the communities that were targeted. The barriers to entry in the legal cannabis market are enormous. In California, opening a dispensary can require over $250,000 in in startup capital before the first sale is made. Licensing fees, regulatory compliance, security requirements, real estate costs, legal fees, all of it adds up to sums that are simply out of reach for people who have spent decades being denied economic opportunity by the very laws that criminalized what is now a legitimate business. Many states initially banned people with marijuana convictions from participating in the legal industry, the final insult to those who had been punished for doing exactly what is now celebrated. Social equity programs have been implemented in some states, offering reduced fees or priority licensing to applicants from communities disproportionately impacted by prohibition. But these programs have been plagued by underfunding, bureaucratic delays, and outright fraud, with wealthy applicants using minority partners as fronts to gain social equity status before buying them out. Meanwhile, an estimated 32,000 people remain incarcerated for cannabis offences across America. The exact number is difficult to determine because data collection is inconsistent, but the reality is undeniable. People are sitting in prison cells right now for conduct that is legal in the state next door, for conduct that is making other people millionaires. Some progress has been made on expungement. Illinois has cleared over 700,000 cannabis records through automatic expungement. New Jersey has dismissed hundreds of thousands of cases. California and Maryland have followed suit, but the process is slow, incomplete, and requires individuals in many states to navigate a complex legal system they cannot afford. We built a billion-dollar industry on the ruins of communities that prohibition destroyed, and then we made it nearly impossible for those communities to participate in the wealth. The safety comparison that prohibition ignored remains the most damning indictment of the entire enterprise. In the history of recorded medicine, there has never been a verified death from marijuana overdose alone. 0. The lethal dose of THC is so high that it is effectively impossible to achieve through any normal method of consumption. Meanwhile, alcohol kills over 140,000 Americans every year. Tobacco kills over 480,000. Opioids, many of them legally prescribed, kill over 100,000. A 2015 study published in Scientific Reports compared the toxicity of various recreational substances and found that marijuana was approximately 114 times less risky than alcohol. Between 25 and 30% of violent crimes are linked to alcohol use. Marijuana is not associated with violence at all. The drug that is classified in Schedule 1, defined as having high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use, kills no one. The drugs that are legal and advertised during the Super Bowl kill more than 600,000 Americans every year. The classification was never about safety. The scheduling was never about science. It was about politics, about power, about which populations used which substances and which populations needed to be controlled. Science lost to politics, and it lost for a century. So here we are, a plant that was medicine is medicine again, a plant that built empires can be bought at a dispensary, a plant that sent people to prison makes investors rich. The same plant, different rules for different people. The question was never really about the plant. It was always about who used it, who controlled it, and who profited. A century of prohibition, and we are right back where we started, except for the millions of lives that were destroyed in between, the communities that were shattered, the families that were separated, the potential that was wasted. That debt has not been paid. That debt may never be paid, but it can be named, it can be remembered, it can be refused. Let us be clear about what the war on marijuana actually accomplished. It did not reduce marijuana use. Americans use cannabis today at higher rates than they did when prohibition began, and the drug is more readily available than ever. It did not protect public health. The substance that was classified as among the most dangerous drugs known to medicine has never killed a single person through overdose, while the legal drugs that fund our sports stadiums and fill our television commercials kill over 600,000 Americans every year. It did not make communities safer. The neighborhoods that were most heavily policed, most aggressively targeted, most thoroughly saturated with drug enforcement are not safer today than they were before the war began. What prohibition did accomplish was everything it was actually designed to do. It filled prisons until the United States became the most incarcerated nation in the history of the world. It cost taxpayers trillions of dollars that could have funded schools and hospitals and infrastructure. It enriched criminal organizations from the cartels of Mexico to the gangs of American cities, handing them a monopoly on a product that millions of people wanted to buy. It distorted law enforcement, creating incentives for police to pursue easy marijuana arrests rather than investigate serious crimes, to seize assets from suspected drug offenders without conviction, to treat entire communities as enemy territory. It violated basic human rights, kicking down doors without warrants, separating children from parents, denying people the right to vote and work and live in dignity because of choices they made about what to put in their own bodies. And it was based on lies, documented, exposed, undeniable lies. Harry Anslinger lied about Victor Licata. He lied about the connection between marijuana and violence. He lied to Congress, and Congress did not care. Richard Nixon lied about the dangers of marijuana. He commissioned a study that told him the truth, and he buried it. Every administration since has perpetuated those lies, maintained the Schedule 1 classification that everyone knows is scientifically absurd, continued to enforce laws that everyone knows were designed to target black and brown people. The stated goals of prohibition all failed. The unstated goals, the goals John Ehrlichman described in that devastating interview, were achieved completely. The anti-war movement was disrupted. Black communities were devastated. A permanent underclass of convicted felons was created, stripped of rights and opportunities, marked for life. The social hierarchy that those in power wanted to maintain was maintained. The truth about cannabis is neither what the prohibitionists claimed nor what some of its most enthusiastic advocates suggest. It is a remarkably versatile plant that has accompanied humanity for 10,000 years, serving as fiber and food and medicine and sacrament across cultures and continents. It is not harmless. Regular use, particularly of high-potency products, can contribute to dependence. It can affect the developing brains of adolescents. It can, in some vulnerable individuals, contribute to or exacerbate mental health conditions. These are real concerns that deserve honest engagement, the kind of engagement that prohibition made impossible by classifying the plant alongside heroin and making serious research nearly illegal. But cannabis is also not the demon it was made out to be. It does not cause violence. The mountains of evidence accumulated over the past century show no connection between marijuana use and aggression. It does not inevitably lead to harder drugs. The gateway theory has been thoroughly debunked by researchers who found that correlation is not causation and that the vast majority of marijuana users never progress to other substances. For millions of people, it provides genuine relief from chronic pain, from the nausea of chemotherapy, from the anxiety that makes daily life a struggle, from the insomnia that steals rest and health. For millions more, it is simply a mild intoxicant, a way to relax at the end of the day, no more dangerous than a glass of wine and considerably less dangerous than the whiskey that is sold in every grocery store in America. The question of marijuana was never really about marijuana. It was about who used it and what those people represented to those in power. It was about Mexicans and black people and hippies and anyone else who needed to be controlled. True justice would require more than legalization. It would require reckoning. Every marijuana conviction in American history should be expunged automatically and completely, the records sealed as if they never existed. Every person still imprisoned for marijuana offenses should be released immediately and unconditionally. Those who served years or decades for conduct that is now legal, that is now making other people rich, should be compensated for the time that was stolen from them. The billions of dollars in tax revenue generated by legal cannabis should be invested directly in the communities that prohibition devastated, funding schools and job training and housing and healthcare in the neighborhoods that were treated as occupied territory by drug enforcement. The infrastructure of the drug war should be dismantled, the militarized police units defunded, the asset forfeiture laws repealed, the mandatory minimum sentences abolished. And the legal cannabis industry should be required, not encouraged but required, to provide meaningful access to the people who were criminalized for doing what corporations now do with government blessing. Some of this is happening. Hundreds of thousands of records have been expunged, some prisoners have been released, some states have created social equity programs, but it is happening slowly, incompletely, against resistance from those who profited from prohibition and those who profit from its unequal aftermath. The debt remains largely unpaid. The books remain largely unbalanced. The industry builds its gleaming dispensaries on the ruins of communities it has no intention of restoring. The plant will grow. It always has. Through prohibition and persecution, through propaganda and paranoia, through a century of war waged against it, cannabis has endured. It grew in the fields of Virginia when the founders mandated its cultivation. It grew in the hidden gardens of jazz musicians and migrant workers when police hunted them for possessing it. It grew in the basements and backyards of Americans who decided that unjust laws did not deserve their obedience. It grows now in licensed facilities and legal dispensaries, transformed from contraband to commodity, from menace to merchandise. The plant does not know the difference. It simply does what it has always done, reaching toward the sun, producing its flowers, spreading its seeds, waiting for the next generation. The question was never about the plant. It was about us, about what kind of society we choose to build, about whether we have the courage to face our history honestly, to name the racism and the lies and the cruelty for what they were, to repair what can be repaired, and to refuse to repeat what should never have happened. The war on marijuana was never about marijuana. It was about Mexicans in El Paso in 1915. It was about black jazz musicians in Harlem in the 1930s. It was about anti-war protesters and civil rights activists in the 1960s. It was about anyone who threatened the established order, anyone who needed to be controlled, anyone whose customs or culture or politics made them a target. It was about power, and it was about race, and it was built on lies from the very beginning. That war is not over. It has merely entered a new phase, one where the battleground has shifted, but the fundamental questions remain. Who benefits from the law and who suffers under it? Who gets compassion and who gets handcuffs? Who builds wealth and who inherits poverty? The ending of this story has not been written. It depends on choices that are being made right now in legislatures and courtrooms and voting booths, in communities and corporations and individual consciences. The plant is just a plant. What we do with that knowledge, what kind of justice we demand, what kind of future we build, that is on us. The story of marijuana is the story of America, of who we have been and who we might become. Now you know how it began. What happens next is not history, it is choice.